The morning over the Texas test airfield was so clear that nobody believed disaster could touch it. When the $50 million jet engine began to whine, little Mia tugged her father's sleeve and said the airplane was crying. Chief Executive Madison laughed it off as a child's foolish imagination. But Mason heard something else entirely beneath the turbine roar, a thin, uneven pulse, the sound of metal preparing to fail. His warning was waved aside. Minutes later, the jet screamed down the runway, and an explosion tore through the company's proudest achievement, scattering fire across the clear morning sky. Stay with this story to the end to discover who truly made that airplane cry across a bright morning sky. The story opened at a private test airfield in Texas on a morning of clear skies, strong sun, and perfect visibility. Madison's Aviation Corporation was preparing to test a new jet engine prototype valued at $50 million. This was a critical test flight, attended by investors, board members, engineering teams, internal media staff, and outside safety observers. If the test succeeded, Madison would save her company from losing a major defense contract that had taken years to secure. If it failed, her entire career as chief executive could collapse in a single morning. Madison believed every condition was perfect that day, with clear skies, a dry runway, green sensor readings, and clean technical reports stacked neatly on her desk. Mason was only a contract maintenance technician, working at the edge of the airfield, never permitted inside the executive command room where the real decisions were made. For years he had repaired aging engines, learning to hear the sound of machinery, the vibration, the friction of metal against metal, through pure professional instinct rather than formal engineering credentials. Because his usual babysitter had canceled at the last minute, Mason had been forced to bring his young daughter Mia to the staff safety area for a few minutes early that morning. When the engine began its first low startup, Mia heard a strange sound and told her father that the airplane was crying. Mason immediately paid attention, because beneath the turbine noise he also heard a thin whine that did not belong there. From what seemed like an innocent remark from a child, Mason detected the early signature of a flaw that could destroy the entire engine before it ever left the ground. Madison dismissed the warning outright, trusting her official reports far more than the instincts of a single father with no formal title in her organization. From this moment forward, the story became a battle between a man who knew how to listen to machinery and a woman too proud to listen to another human being standing right in front of her. The tension between them would decide far more than the fate of one engine test. It would decide who was allowed to speak the truth inside a corporation built on image, and who would be silenced simply for lacking the correct title on a badge. Mason had never wanted attention or recognition of any kind. He came to the airfield each morning simply to do careful, honest work, checking bolts, listening to engines, filling out logs that few executives ever bothered to read. His life outside the airfield was quiet as well, built around modest routines, a small house, and the steady responsibility of raising Mia alone since her mother had passed away years earlier. He rarely spoke of that loss, choosing instead to pour his attention into precision, into the discipline of machines that never lied about their condition if a person knew how to listen carefully enough. Madison's world stood in sharp contrast to his own. She had spent a decade climbing through finance and strategy divisions before reaching the top office, learning early that confidence often mattered more than patience in rooms filled with powerful men and skeptical investors. She trusted spreadsheets, projections, and polished presentations far more than she trusted instinct, and she had built an entire leadership style around the belief that hesitation was simply weakness dressed up as caution. That belief was about to be tested in ways she never expected, on a runway she had walked across many times without ever truly listening to what moved beneath her own feet. Around them both moved dozens of other people that morning, engineers checking clipboards, camera crews preparing to capture footage for internal promotional use, and investors sipping coffee while they waited for a demonstration they assumed would only confirm what they already believed about the company's success. The Texas test airfield stretched out bright and clear beneath a sky without a single cloud. The runway was dry, the sunlight glinting off the polished silver fuselage of the jet, giving everyone present the impression that this would be the morning of a great victory. Madison stepped out of a sleek black car, appearing before her assembled team with a cold and commanding presence that left no room for doubt. She reminded everyone gathered that today's test flight would prove her corporation remained the undisputed leader of the entire aviation industry. Connor reported that every sensor was stable, that engine temperature sat well within range, and that oil pressure showed no abnormal readings whatsoever. Xavier leaned close to Madison and whispered that the investors were watching every second of the proceedings, and that nothing, however small, could be allowed to delay the schedule they had promised. Mason stood off in the secondary technical zone, wearing his worn work jacket, checking his tools and observing the engine from a distance most executives never noticed. He did not belong to the senior engineering group, so he had no voice inside the executive meeting where the real decisions were made that morning. Mia sat behind a glass partition in the designated safety zone, waiting only briefly until a relative could come collect her, appearing in this opening scene and then fading from the unfolding drama. When the jet engine began spinning at low power, the sound of the turbine rose steady and even through the clear morning air. Without warning, Mia tugged gently at her father's sleeve and told him that the airplane was crying. Mason did not laugh. He stood completely still, tilting his head to listen more closely. Beneath the powerful roar of the turbine, he detected an extremely thin whine, something that resembled dry metal grinding softly against metal. He walked quickly to a secondary display screen, checked the vibration readings, and noticed a small oscillation that had not yet reached the threshold needed to trigger any alarm. To anyone else, that number would have seemed harmless and forgettable. To Mason, that exact sound was the unmistakable signature of a turbine bearing suffering from improper friction deep inside its casing. He immediately requested a pause in the startup sequence so he could inspect the auxiliary oil assembly before anything proceeded further. One of the senior engineers laughed aloud, suggesting that Mason was overreacting simply because of an offhand remark from a small child standing nearby. Mason remained firm, understanding clearly that an engine did not need to roar violently before it could already be considered dangerous to everyone standing near it. Mason tried once more to explain his concern in simple terms, describing how a bearing under strain would often whisper long before it ever screamed, and how the earliest stage of failure was always the quietest one. The senior engineer waved him off a second time, more interested in maintaining the schedule than in entertaining a theory built on sound alone rather than printed numbers. Mason glanced briefly toward the glass partition where Mia still sat, swinging her small feet against the bench, unaware that her simple observation had already set something enormous into motion. He thought of every engine he had ever repaired over the years, and how each one had taught him that machines rarely failed without warning. They simply failed in a language that most people never learned to hear. As the scene closed beneath that flawless blue sky, Mason stood watching the jet let out its faint rising whine, and he understood with total certainty that disaster could begin from the smallest, quietest sound imaginable. Mason tried to make his way toward the coordination area so he could speak directly with Madison before the schedule moved any further along. Security staff stopped him almost immediately, reminding him firmly that he was only a contracted technician with no clearance to enter that restricted zone. Madison heard the commotion and stepped forward, visibly irritated that her carefully planned timeline had been interrupted without warning. Mason explained quickly that the engine was producing a strange whine, one that could be linked to the turbine bearing, the auxiliary oil line, or unusual heat friction building somewhere inside the housing. Madison asked him bluntly whether he had any official data to support such a serious claim. Connor immediately produced a report showing that every recorded measurement still fell safely within the accepted operational range. Mason pushed back, explaining that sensors often failed to catch early resonance flaws at low rotation speeds, especially when the defect was still forming in its earliest stage of development. Madison glanced briefly toward the glass partition where Mia was being led away from the main area by a staff member named Grace. She said coldly that a $50 million aviation test could not simply be delayed because of an offhand remark from a child. That remark silenced Mason for several long seconds, though he managed to remain composed despite the sting of her words. He told Madison plainly that children might not understand engines, but sound itself never learned how to lie about what was happening inside a machine. Xavier interjected quickly, reminding Madison that investors had already flown to Texas, that the contract was waiting, and that the entire board was watching her performance closely that morning. Caught between safety and her own public image, Madison chose to protect her image instead of listening further. She gave the order to continue the startup sequence exactly as planned. Mason asked for at least 10 minutes to inspect the bearing assembly before anything moved forward toward takeoff. Connor rejected the request outright, insisting that opening the inspection panel now would ruin the entire test schedule beyond repair. Madison ordered security to escort Mason away from the central technical zone immediately. Mason did not resist. He only looked directly at Madison and told her that if the jet took off carrying that sound inside it, she would not lose 10 minutes of her schedule, she would lose the entire engine itself. Madison turned away, choosing to interpret his words as nothing more than a bitter threat from a disgruntled employee. Mason stood alone at the perimeter fence, hands loose at his sides, resisting the urge to shout again since he understood no one in that command room wanted to hear him anymore. He thought of all the times a quiet warning had been proven right long after the moment to act had already passed, and how often the people with the least power turned out to be the ones who saw disaster coming first. Somewhere behind the glass, Madison straightened her jacket and turned back toward her guests, forcing a calm smile onto her face as though nothing troubling had just occurred. She told the investors standing beside her that a few nervous voices were common before any major test, and that confidence, not hesitation, was what built great companies. Connor stood at her side nodding along, privately relieved that attention had shifted away from the component records sitting quietly in his own private files. As the scene closed under the blinding morning sun, engine power increased steadily, and Mason listened as that thin whine climbed higher with every passing second, each rising note tightening the knot of dread inside his chest. Caleb, the lead test pilot, sat inside the cockpit finishing his final checklist with the calm focus that came from years of experience in the air. He recognized that he needed to apply thrust slightly slower than usual, so the engine could respond with greater stability under pressure. When Caleb reported a slight vibration near the team, Connor dismissed it quickly as nothing more than a natural fluctuation caused by the heated surface of the runway. Madison stood inside the glass observation deck, her expression calm and composed, surrounded by investors and board members watching every movement below. Mason remained at the outer edge of the technical zone, stripped of access to the primary communication line used by the flight team. Still, he continued watching with his own eyes and with the trained ear of a lifelong technician. As the jet began rolling forward, the turbine sound turned uneven, producing a sharp rising pitch that resembled metal on the verge of cracking apart. Mason spotted a thin trail of pale gray smoke escaping near the engine exhaust outlet. Under the bright daylight, that trail of smoke appeared unmistakably clear, yet the coordination team remained too focused on their monitors to notice it in time. Mason shouted for the flight to be aborted immediately. No one listened to him. Caleb felt a slight jolt run through the airframe as engine power continued climbing higher. Just as the jet reached high speed along the runway, the engine let out a dry cracking explosion, followed instantly by the sound of metal tearing apart from within. Caleb reacted instantly, aborting takeoff, slamming the emergency brakes, and keeping the aircraft from careening past the far end of the runway. The $50 million engine burst into flame along one side, sending fragments flying outward as black smoke rose against the bright blue sky. No one was killed, but the entire airfield fell into a stunned and horrified silence. Madison stood frozen behind the glass. The weather had been perfect. The conditions had been perfect. The reports had been perfect, and still the engine had failed catastrophically. Slowly, Madison's gaze searched the crowd until it found Mason standing at the edge of the wreckage. The only person she had dismissed with contempt only minutes earlier was the only person who had warned her clearly beforehand. Emergency vehicles rushed onto the tarmac, sirens cutting through the stunned quiet that had settled over the crowd of investors and executives. Caleb climbed down from the cockpit shaking, grateful to be alive, his eyes immediately searching the wreckage to understand exactly what had gone wrong beneath him only seconds earlier. Connor rushed forward as well, already speaking in a low, urgent voice to anyone nearby about how quickly the incident could be explained away as an unpredictable mechanical anomaly. Xavier stood pale and rigid, doing rapid mental calculations about stock prices, contract penalties, and the impossible conversations that now waited for him with furious investors. Madison remained motionless behind the glass for several long seconds, unable to look away from the twisted metal and drifting smoke that had, only minutes earlier, been her company's greatest source of pride. As the scene closed, black smoke curled upward through the bright morning air, undeniable proof that the airplane had truly been crying all along, and that somewhere beneath the polished reports, a warning had been ignored by everyone who mattered most. Immediately after the disaster, an emergency meeting convened inside the airfield's administrative offices. Madison demanded that Connor explain how an engine officially declared safe could have exploded so violently on the open runway. Connor moved quickly to redirect suspicion toward Mason instead of accepting any responsibility himself. He claimed Mason had shown a defiant attitude before the test, had repeatedly requested delays to the schedule and had approached the engine zone shortly before the startup sequence began. Xavier immediately supported this theory, since the corporation urgently needed a simple explanation to present to its anxious investors. If the failure was traced back to design flaws, management decisions, or a rushed launch schedule, the resulting damage would be far more severe for the company as a whole. Madison was not fully convinced that Mason had sabotaged anything, but panic had already begun to cloud her judgment. To protect the corporation's public image, she signed an order suspending Mason from every facility under company control. His toolbox was confiscated, his access badge deactivated, and his employment file placed under formal investigation. Mason was summoned into a security office and questioned about why he had repeatedly demanded that the flight be halted. He answered honestly that he had tried to stop it because he had heard a genuine flaw, not because he wanted to cause any disruption to a schedule he had never cared about in the first place. Connor claimed there existed no official record confirming that Mason's warning had ever been verified by legitimate data. A secondary camera positioned near the technical zone was suddenly reported as having suffered a storage malfunction at a convenient moment. Caleb's earlier report describing a slight vibration was also quietly revised to state that no significant abnormality had been detected. Mason understood that he was being turned into a convenient scapegoat for a failure far larger than himself. He left the airfield under the harsh midday sun, without a job, without access to the technical areas, and facing the very real possibility of legal action against him. Yet what wounded him most was not the insult to his professional reputation, nor the sudden loss of income he badly needed. What wounded him most was that Madison had mocked the very first warning simply because it had come from his young daughter. Word of his suspension spread quickly through the small circle of contract workers who knew him, most of them too afraid of losing their own positions to speak up on his behalf. A few colleagues offered quiet nods of sympathy in hallways, careful never to be seen talking with him directly, since association alone now felt dangerous inside the company. Mason drove home that afternoon in silence, replaying the entire morning over and over, searching for anything he could have done differently to make Madison listen sooner. He thought of Mia waiting for him, innocent of everything unfolding around her father, and he resolved that whatever came next, he would not let her grow up believing that telling the truth was something to be punished for. As the scene closed, Mason looked back at the lingering trail of smoke still hanging faintly in the sky, and he silently vowed to uncover exactly who had killed a $50 million engine before it ever left the ground. Mason began his own private investigation using only what he legally still possessed from his shift work, including personal timing notes, private inspection logs, old sound samples, and rotation figures recorded during startup. He did not break into any system, steal any data, or trespass on restricted property. He relied only on his own experience and memory, built from listening to hundreds of engines across every stage of health and failure throughout his long career. Mason analyzed that the whine had not originated from the main fan blades, but rather from the turbine bearing positioned toward the rear of the assembly. If that bearing had been ground unevenly, it would produce a very thin sound at low rotation speeds, later transforming into a powerful vibration once thrust increased sharply. This matched precisely what Caleb had felt inside the cockpit moments before the aborted takeoff. Mason arranged to meet Caleb quietly at a coffee shop near the airfield perimeter. Caleb was cautious at first, since he remained an active employee of the corporation and had much to lose by speaking freely. Mason did not pressure Caleb to take his side. He asked only a single question, wondering if Caleb would dare fly again, knowing that exact sound still lived somewhere inside the airframe. Caleb fell silent for a long moment, then admitted quietly that his original vibration report had indeed been altered after the fact. Mason next reached out to Ryan, an independent aviation safety inspector who had known him from previous maintenance cases years earlier. Ryan agreed to examine the situation, since an engine explosion occurring under clear skies, a dry runway, and green sensor readings raised serious and immediate concern. Mason discovered that a component serial number listed in the final inspection record did not match the batch that had originally been approved for use. He suspected that someone had quietly replaced a certified bearing with an unverified component that had never passed proper safety testing. Meanwhile, Madison faced intense and relentless questioning from her own board of directors. She began noticing that Connor consistently avoided any direct question regarding the replacement components used inside the failed engine. Ryan warned Mason that pursuing this investigation without proper authority could expose him to further legal risk, since the corporation had already shown a willingness to protect its image over the truth. Mason accepted that risk without hesitation, explaining that he had spent his entire career trusting the sound of metal, and he refused to stop trusting it now simply because powerful people found it inconvenient. He spent long evenings at his kitchen table, sound files playing softly through cheap speakers, comparing waveforms by hand, marking down every irregularity he noticed no matter how small it seemed. Some nights Mia would peek into the doorway before bed, asking quietly whether her father had found what made the airplane cry, and Mason always promised her that he was getting closer. Caleb quietly passed along additional cockpit telemetry whenever he found a safe opportunity, careful never to be seen doing so on any company camera or logged system. Ryan cross-referenced the component serial numbers against a national safety database, confirming that the flagged batch had already caused minor issues in 2 unrelated test programs elsewhere in the industry. That detail alone suggested the problem was not an isolated mistake, but a pattern someone inside the corporation had chosen to overlook repeatedly. Slowly, a clear and consistent pattern began to emerge from the scattered pieces of evidence Mason had gathered outside the reach of Connor's influence. As the scene closed, Mason placed his sound analysis on the table and understood clearly that the airplane had not cried out of superstition, but because someone had knowingly placed a flawed metal heart inside its core. Madison asked Abigail, her board's legal advisor, to review every document connected to the disaster in full detail. Abigail quickly discovered strange gaps scattered throughout the technical timeline that did not add up under close examination. A secondary maintenance camera had preserved a partial audio recording captured just before the explosion occurred. When Madison listened to it, she clearly recognized Mason's voice demanding that the engine be shut down immediately. Behind his voice sat that same thin whine, nearly buried beneath the roar of the turbine, yet unmistakably present once she knew to listen for it. That sound sent a cold chill through her entire body. She remembered the look on Mason's face as security pulled him away from the technical zone that morning. She also remembered the exact words she had used to mock his very first warning. Abigail cautioned Madison that if the company had knowingly ignored a genuine safety risk, this incident would no longer remain a simple matter of property damage, but could quickly escalate into a serious legal crisis. Madison remained afraid because admitting that Mason had been right meant admitting that she herself had been deeply wrong. Even so, she began to grow suspicious of Connor's behavior throughout the entire ordeal. Madison quietly arranged to meet Mason at a small repair shop just outside the airfield during the late afternoon sun. The meeting was tense. Mason did not shout, did not beg, and did not gloat over being proven correct. He simply explained that many technical disasters did not begin with a flashing red alarm, but instead began with a quiet sound that someone with authority chose to ignore. Madison asked what he needed in order to prove the truth beyond any doubt. Mason told her he required access to the wrecked engine, the original vibration data, the component records, and Caleb's full cockpit recording. Madison stood at a difficult crossroads, forced to choose between protecting her position through silence or reopening the investigation and placing herself directly in the center of the coming storm. In the end, she granted Mason formal legal access to the storage facility holding the burned engine wreckage. Madison sat alone in her car for several minutes after leaving the repair shop, replaying every dismissive word she had spoken to Mason that morning on the runway. She realized that her entire leadership philosophy had been built around projecting certainty, even in moments when certainty was exactly the wrong instinct to trust. Abigail called later that evening to remind her that the board would expect answers soon, and that half measures would satisfy no one once the investigation truly began to unfold. Madison thought about Connor's calm reassurances throughout the entire crisis, and how convenient his explanations had always sounded, perhaps too convenient for a disaster of this scale. She thought too of Mia's small voice describing an airplane that was crying, a description so simple that no adult in that command room had thought to take it seriously. As the scene closed, for the very first time, Madison did not order Mason to stay silent. Instead, she quietly began learning how to listen, one uncomfortable truth at a time. Mason, Ryan, Abigail, and Caleb entered the storage facility, holding the wrecked engine under the close supervision of the legal department. The setting was a bright, clean, cold hangar, standing in stark contrast to the blackened mass of scorched metal resting on the floor before them. Mason examined the rear turbine bearing assembly and immediately found uneven marks along its surface. Ryan confirmed that this damage had not resulted from the explosion itself, but had clearly existed before the engine ever increased to full power. Caleb compared the timing of the vibration he had felt in the cockpit against whatever data remained recoverable from the wreckage. The results matched perfectly with the exact moment Mason had first heard that thin whine out on the runway earlier that morning. Abigail retrieved the original component shipment records and found a batch of turbine bearings that had previously been flagged for irregular heat tolerance. This particular batch should never have been installed inside a test engine under any circumstance. A far more serious problem emerged when the serial number recovered from the burned engine matched precisely the batch that had already been flagged for concern. Mason discovered that the final inspection report had been quietly altered sometime after his shift had ended. The trace of that alteration led directly back to an account belonging to Connor, the senior technical director himself. Madison confronted Connor inside a sunlit glass office later that same afternoon. Connor denied everything, insisting that Mason was simply fabricating a story out of bitterness over his earlier suspension. Xavier sided firmly with Connor, terrified that the company's valuation would collapse entirely if the truth ever became public. Madison slowly began to understand that this disaster was not merely a technical failure. It was the result of a long chain of greedy decisions, cheaper components, silenced warnings, altered reports, and a launch schedule pushed forward no matter the cost. Mason found a discarded washer inside a technical waste bin, still bearing the distinct oil residue characteristic of the uncertified component batch. Ryan explained patiently that certified components existed precisely to prevent this kind of failure, and that whoever had approved the substitution had gambled an entire test flight and Caleb's life to save a comparatively small amount of money. Abigail traced the purchase order back through several layers of internal approval, each signature adding another name to the growing list of people who bore some responsibility for the decision. Mason stayed quiet through most of the discovery process, letting the evidence speak plainly rather than adding his own anger into the mix of facts already piling up around them. Caleb admitted that he had always trusted the engineering team completely, and that this entire experience had shaken his confidence in a system he once assumed was beyond question. Madison listened to every detail without interrupting, feeling the weight of each new revelation settle heavier onto her shoulders than the last. As the scene closed, Madison stared at the small object sealed inside an evidence bag, realizing that one cheap, overlooked part had destroyed a $50 million engine because of an arrogance far more costly than the part itself. Connor realized that Madison was growing suspicious of him, and he moved quickly to erase the original telemetry recordings before anyone else could examine them. That telemetry data represented the single most important piece of evidence, since it proved abnormal vibration had appeared well before the jet ever reached full acceleration. Mason suspected that Connor would never allow that data to survive long enough to reach the upcoming board meeting. Madison, Mason, and Abigail arrived at the technical data center late in the afternoon, sunlight still streaming through the long glass corridors surrounding them. They discovered Connor using his administrative privileges to replace the original recording with a file that had already been quietly altered. Connor abandoned his professional composure entirely, accusing Madison of growing weak for listening to a mere contract technician instead of trusting her own trained engineers. He argued that in this industry, nobody halted a $100 million deal simply because of a faint whining sound. Mason replied that nobody should gamble a pilot's life either, just to protect a falling stock price. Connor attempted to leave the room carrying a storage drive containing the original data. Caleb had already managed to back up a portion of the readings from his own private cockpit system, creating an undeniable point of comparison against any altered file. Ryan, along with the internal safety team, intercepted Connor in the technical corridor before he could escape with the evidence. Madison watched with her own eyes as the man she had once trusted completely tried to destroy the very proof that could clear an innocent man's name. She understood that her own arrogance had created the exact opening Connor needed to manipulate the entire corporation from within. Mason did not strike Connor, did not threaten him, and simply demanded that every storage device in the room be sealed immediately. Abigail sent an urgent report straight to the board of directors and to the National Aviation Safety Authority without delay. Connor was suspended on the spot, though he still warned Madison that if the full truth came out, she would lose her position as chief executive as well. Madison did not answer him right away. She looked instead at Mason, and then at the sealed data drive resting quietly on the table between them. Security escorted Connor from the building as he continued shouting that Madison would regret siding with outsiders over her own trusted engineering staff. Xavier, watching from a distance, quietly slipped away before anyone thought to question him further about his own role in pressuring the schedule forward. Abigail assured Madison that the sealed telemetry, combined with Caleb's backup recordings, would be more than sufficient to establish a clear and complete timeline for investigators. Mason felt no satisfaction in Connor's downfall, only a tired relief that the truth had finally been protected from erasure at the last possible moment. He thought briefly of Mia, wondering how he would explain any of this to her someday, and decided that the simplest version would always be the truest one. Ryan quietly told Mason that few people would ever know how much courage it had taken to keep pushing when every door in the corporation had been closed against him. As the scene closed beneath the fading afternoon light, Madison finally understood that the most frightening thing was never the explosion itself, but the number of times she had chosen not to listen before it happened. The board of directors convened a special meeting the following morning inside a conference room high above the city. Sunlight poured through the tall glass windows, creating an atmosphere where no lie seemed able to find a place to hide any longer. Madison stood before the board, and for the first time she did not open with a confident, prepared speech. Connor arrived with his own personal attorney, still attempting to project the image of an innocent and competent technical executive. Xavier proposed that the corporation simply place the entire blame on Mason in order to close the crisis as quickly as possible. He argued that the market only needed a clear and simple story, not a complicated and uncomfortable truth. Abigail countered firmly that concealing evidence would transform a matter of property damage into outright fraud and a serious violation of federal safety regulations. Mason was invited into the boardroom. He wore no expensive suit, only a plain button shirt, and carried his sound analysis folder under one arm. Connor mocked him openly, insisting that a mere contract technician could never understand a system designed by an entire team of senior engineers. Mason did not argue with emotion. He simply played the recorded startup sound, followed immediately by a comparison recording of a healthy, properly functioning bearing. Everyone in the room heard the unmistakable difference, a thin, steady, dangerous whine appearing well before any official reading had turned negative. Ryan presented his independent findings, confirming that the flaw had existed before takeoff and had not resulted from any sabotage occurring after the original inspection. Caleb confirmed that he had indeed reported a slight vibration from inside the cockpit, though his statement had later been softened inside the official written report. Abigail presented clear evidence showing the mismatched component serial number alongside the exact timestamp of the falsified report. Madison finally rose to her feet. She admitted openly that she had ignored Mason's warning that morning. She admitted that she had allowed commercial pressure to override basic technical safety. But she also publicly identified Connor and Xavier as the two men who had concealed a defective component batch, altered critical data, and manipulated the entire chain of reporting. Connor lost his composure completely, blurting out that if they had not pushed the flight forward, the corporation would have lost the contract entirely. That single sentence became, in that instant, a full confession delivered directly before the board. Board members exchanged uneasy glances, some visibly angry at having nearly approved a plan to blame an innocent man simply to protect quarterly earnings projections. One senior board member asked Madison directly why she had ignored a warning delivered so clearly on the morning of the test. Madison answered honestly, admitting that she had valued her own confidence more than the judgment of a person she considered beneath her attention. She added that this failure belonged to her leadership as much as it belonged to Connor's dishonesty, and that real reform had to begin with her own decisions first. Ryan closed his presentation by stating plainly that had the test been paused for even 10 minutes, the entire disaster could likely have been avoided entirely. Xavier tried once more to salvage his position, arguing that the pressure to keep the schedule had come from the entire leadership team and not from him alone. Abigail reminded him that pressure was never an excuse for concealing a documented safety flag, and that his signature appeared on more than one document tied to the decision. The room fell into a heavy silence as the full weight of that simple statement settled over everyone present. As the scene closed inside that brightly lit room, the truth required no shouting at all. It only needed to be played back through the sound of an airplane once dismissed and ignored. Connor was terminated immediately, and his case was formally referred to federal investigators for further review. Xavier was also forced out of the company for pressuring the team to conceal a known financial and safety risk. The board of directors initially demanded that Madison resign her position entirely, but Abigail proposed an alternative path, offering Madison a chance to redeem herself if she agreed to fully reform the corporation's entire safety framework from the ground up. Madison did not seek forgiveness through polished, empty words. Instead, she appeared before the full staff at the very test airfield where the explosion had originally occurred. The sky above was still clear and bright, the runway freshly repaired, though a faint scorch mark from the earlier disaster still lingered quietly on the concrete below. Madison openly admitted that the $50 million engine had not been lost because a single father had caused unnecessary trouble. It had been lost because leadership had dismissed a small warning, undervalued real experience, and placed reputation above genuine safety. She apologized to Mason directly in front of the entire technical staff gathered that morning. Mason did not offer instant forgiveness, but he accepted that the truth had finally been restored to its rightful place. Madison offered Mason the newly created position of lead advisor for turbine sound safety within the company's revised certification program. Mason initially refused, unwilling to become a public symbol representing the corporation's past failures and mistakes. Caleb convinced him that if Mason walked away entirely, men like Connor would simply return again someday under a different name and a different title. Mason finally agreed, but only under one clear condition. Every technician, whether a senior engineer or a lowly contract worker, would have the guaranteed right to halt any test procedure the moment they identified a reasonable safety concern. Madison accepted that condition without hesitation, recognizing that it addressed the exact failure that had nearly cost lives and had certainly cost the company its reputation. She also insisted that Abigail draft formal protections ensuring no employee could ever again be suspended or punished simply for raising a legitimate safety warning. The corporation rebuilt its entire certification process, adding an independent sound analysis stage, tamper-proof data storage, and formal protections for any employee who raised an internal safety warning. Several months later, a new engine test was scheduled once again during daylight hours beneath a clear open sky. This time, Madison did not stand first at the podium to speak. She stood quietly beside the technical crew, listening carefully as Mason explained every stage of the startup sound in detail. The new engine ran smoothly with no trace of the earlier abnormal whine anywhere in its operation. Caleb lifted off safely, the jet climbing steadily into a bright, clear blue sky. Later that evening, Mason returned home where Mia briefly appeared and asked if the airplane still cried. Mason smiled gently and told her that this time, it was singing instead. Madison, standing at a distance during a quiet internal ceremony, overheard that small exchange and understood the greatest lesson of her entire career. A company could lose $50 million because of a single defective part, but it could lose absolutely everything if the person leading it remained too proud to listen. In the final scene, Mason walked alongside the technical crew across the bright, sunlit runway, no longer dismissed or overlooked, but recognized as the man who had taught an entire corporation how to listen again to the plain and simple sound of the truth. In the end, this was never only a story about a broken engine or a fortune lost in a single morning. It was a story about the price of arrogance and the quiet courage of a man who trusted the sound of truth over the comfort of silence. Madison learned, at great cost, that leadership means listening even when the voice is small, even when it comes from a child, even when it threatens everything you believe you have built. Mason never asked to be a hero. He only asked to be heard. If this story moved you, carry its lesson forward into your own life. Because somewhere near you right now, a quiet warning may already be waiting for someone brave enough to listen.